Welcome to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant Interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in who gets funded? Become a HAPS donor today by visiting www.hapsfund.com/donate. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another round of HAPS interviews. Today, we are talking to Egyptologists, which is always exciting for me because I don't know anywhere near enough about Egyptology. So this will be lovely. I am not actually conducting our interviews today. We have our wonderful Sarah Moore. Sarah, how are you?
I am doing great, Megan, and always happy to be participating in the HAPS interviews.
Oh, it is always a pleasure to have you. And I, again, appreciate the help because a whole month of like 5-hour interviews is not, it's fun, but it's a lot. So
I mean, it's come a long way since like the original, like 5 or 6 interviews.
Yeah, it's very different when we first started. Okay, so we are about at the top of the hour, so I'm going to remove myself and let Sarah do what she does best and be awesome.
All right, hello everyone. Those of you just joining, you may not recognize me from other videos on the Digital Hammurabi channel, but I am not the star of this. The Egyptology students are. So why don't we go ahead and welcome our first student, David Larson. Hi, David. Thank you so much for joining us. We can't hear you. At least I can't.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries. We have technical difficulties all the time.
All right. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries at all. So thank you so much for joining us. To get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're studying, and what your research interests are?
Sure. So I'm David Larson. I am studying at the University of Memphis in the United States in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm studying Egyptology, obviously. And I'm currently working on I've completed my coursework. I'm working on my dissertation research there. Hopefully we'll graduate next spring if all goes well.
Wow, exciting, getting close.
Yep.
So what are your plans for the summer, and how would HAPS funding help you complete those plans?
Yeah, so basically, as I said, I'm working on my dissertation. So that would be kind of the main thing I'll be working on is the research for that, and hopefully starting to write up some of what I've been finding over the summer. So the HAP scholarship would be helpful just for kind of living expenses, and then can devote more time to the research versus working and other sorts of things. So
for some of you who may be new to the structure of PhDs in the US, it's summer funding is not guaranteed for PhD students. And so I assume that's what David is referring to here, correct, that oftentimes yes, students will have to work, take on other jobs in order to support themselves during the summer. So just to keep that in mind when you're thinking about people describing their plans. So why don't you, I'm going to ask you the question that I'm sure everyone in your life keeps asking you. What is your dissertation on?
Right. So I'm writing about dirt and impurity and those kind of things in ancient Egypt. So, a lot of times when the first thing that comes to people's minds when they think of Egypt and that sort of thing, is the treasures of King Tut and the pyramids and sort of like the glorious idealized royal monuments and that type of thing. But obviously for everybody and for, just daily life and most people, that's golden treasures is not really what daily life looks like. And so I'm kind of looking at, and then also in a lot of Egyptian monuments, temple texts, funerary literature and so on, there's a lot of emphasis on things like purity and clean, and we're giving you the gods clean offerings, and the priests are pure, and sort of this kind of thing. So there's a lot of emphasis on that. But then what the question is, what exactly are they trying to be clean and pure from? So that's kind of what I've trying to look at is and focusing on the daily life aspects of that. So yeah, what are the average person considered to be clean? You know, a lot of people today might take it for granted that, like, you know, taking showers or, you know, that type of thing and washing your hands before eating or so on. You know, we might take those things for granted, but that's not necessarily true everywhere in every place. So what did the ancient Egyptians and that sort of thing. So yeah.
And you know, you're right, this contrast between, you know, the royalty and the gold and all of this stuff in daily life is something that doesn't always make it out of scholarship into the rest of the world when it comes to studying the ancient world, which actually brings us our first question from the audience for you, which is, what kinds of evidence do we have for daily life, and what kinds of evidence are you focusing on for your dissertation?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because obviously that's part of the problem in figuring this out, is because the average person, you know, working in the fields or doing various trades and so on, they aren't leaving us the evidence we would like. You know, it's not like, this is my journal for today. You know, I'm a farmer and this is what I did. And because they can't, most of them, as far as we know, can't write. You know, writing is sort of an elite activity done by professional scribes and so on. So that definitely is a challenge. And one of the biggest things is, yeah, how can we get into like the daily life? So is what I'm doing, is, you know, we have to take the evidence we have. So we can't make it up. So we have various literary documents and this type of thing. And so trying to read into those documents to see what kind of things at least do the scribes say are dirty. So whether or not every average person would consider these things dirty is another question. But, you know, so in the scribes, we have a text called, or it's often called, like, the Satire of the Trades. And it's basically these scribes or students learning to write, and they're sort of making fun of the people doing all these other professions. And then part of the point of it is, like, you know, be a scribe so you're not like these people. But in this text, you know, it says things like, you know, the coppersmith, he smells like fish eggs, or the person tending, you know, this fire, he smells like corpses, or the potter, you know, his clothes they're stiff with mud, and this type of thing. So from that, you know, it's kind of, obviously these are from the perspective of the scribe, so we have to keep that in mind. But at least some people are then considering these things dirty. So apparently fish eggs must smell bad. You know, look, having dirt all over your clothes must not be a pleasant, you know, thing, and that sort of thing. So I'm kind of looking at, my approach in this is sort of a lexical study, which means word studies. So what are the words that they use to describe things as dirty, and so on, and trying to get at the nuance of some of these descriptions, and based on you know, there's multiple words for smell and odors and that type of thing. So what exactly is kind of the nuance behind these words for bad smell, odors, and so on?
Yeah, awesome. That makes a lot of sense. So we have a super chat question. So from Inspired One, thank you so much for your donation. If you would like to make a donation to the HAPS Fund, you can do it via a super chat, or you can donate using the information that's scrolling across the bottom of your screen. So the question for this super chat is, are you studying Upper and Lower Kemet and the periods prior to this time frame?
I'm assuming this Kemet, you're referring to, you know, the Black Land to Egypt. And yeah, basically I'm looking at, because it's a word study, so it's basically, I'm not really looking at before written evidence. So kind of starting in the Old Kingdom period, when we start having solid written evidence, things like the pyramid text and tomb inscriptions and so on. And then I'm looking at evidence pretty much through the entire Pharaonic period. So after the New Kingdom, a little bit into the late period, but I'm not looking at stuff so much from the Greco-Roman period of Egypt.
So we have another audience question for you. Just, do you see any commonalities between what ancient Egyptians considered unclean and impure and other cultures in the ancient Near East?
I mean, yes, probably, I guess yes and no. I'm not obviously as familiar with some of the other cultures to compare. With some things to take, I guess we could, in ancient Israel, the Hebrew Bible, so on. Maybe we're thinking famous texts or things like, the pigs being unclean, and some of those types of things. As far as unclean animals in ancient Egypt, and in that way, it seems to be a lot of that is linked to perhaps status and certain gods. So whereas in like ancient Israel, there's a permanent ban on pigs and eating pigs and so on. In ancient Egypt, it's a little more mixed in the sense of there's texts indicating that, like, for the god Horus, the pig is an abomination, and unclean. Whereas, it might not be that way for everything. So there's evidence, they did keep pigs and eat pigs and so on. So a lot of times in figuring out too, if things are clean, unclean, pure, impure, dirty, and so on, so much of it depends on the context. So a lot of these things aren't absolute in the sense of this is dirty all the time. So there's a lot of, in ancient Egypt, with fish, there's a lot of stuff about fish smelling bad and this kind of thing, and yet we know that they eat fish. And there's also some texts that seem to imply that fishing is a sport. So it's kind of mixed, and if we were to take like the biblical examples, again, fish, there's nothing wrong with, pigs are an abomination, but there's nothing wrong with eating fish. So much of it depends on context. And some of that in Egypt as well might be status. So for example, with the fish, maybe that's more a poor person's meal. And if you have the luxury of eating meat all the time, you can, be, well, I don't eat fish. That's a little bit of speculation reading into some evidence maybe, but.
So I'm not an Egyptologist, so I'm really curious about this question of different unclean animals in different contexts and related to different gods. So do you find that there are any sort of connections or ways where you might suggest that a certain animal might not be considered pure or clean in certain situations or related to certain gods? I'm just thinking as someone outside Egyptology that, some of the gods take on animal forms themselves. And so wondering if that might be a possible connection or if that even is relevant at all.
Yeah. So from, in a lot of ways, there's actually not a whole lot of evidence for this. The pig is a clear one because there's a couple funerary spells which have this story about how the god Seth transforms himself into a pig, and then he harms Horus's eye, and so then the pig becomes, abominable to Horus, and so on. So that's kind of a famous example, but outside of that, there's not as much clear that way until more later that we have, I guess, evidence for till later periods. Once you start getting into, I think, the Greco-Roman period, there's some of these things are more spelled out in some surviving evidence, where there's different, basically each region of Egypt will have different, gods that are said to be the god of this nome or region or whatever. And then there's a certain animal or a plant or something like that might said to be the abomination of that region. But that being Greco-Roman, I'm not super familiar with all of the details of all of which gnomes and which animals and plants and so on are mentioned in all of those. But
yeah, thank you for answering my question. That actually brings up another question for me, that, you mentioned different periods of Egyptian history, and the Egyptian language doesn't have the same periodization. So which, are you working in certain forms of the Egyptian language for these texts about impurity and uncleanness?
yeah, so I mean, it primarily is I'm working in Middle Egyptian, which is kind of sort of the classical form of the language. So that's mostly, the Middle Kingdom period, but then it's sort of like the high literary type text. So there's still texts that are written in largely Middle Egyptian for much later, because it's sort of like the King James or Shakespearean English of ancient Egypt. So I'm doing work in that, and then also late Egyptian, which starts in the later New Kingdom, starts coming up, and that's in various texts like that. So a lot of the texts, not all, but many of the texts mocking like the other professions by the scribes and that type of thing are written in late Egyptian. But that's kind of one of the tricky things, is because the evidence for some of this is so fragmentary, and yet I'm looking at evidence for, over 1,000 years. So in some ways, probably overly generalizing, because that's just so much time. And it's not certain that's, for example, something that's said to be or seems to be unclean in the Old Kingdom or the Middle Kingdom necessarily holds through to the New Kingdom. And then especially when you think, maybe it's different depending on what part of Egypt you're in, whether Upper or Lower Egypt, and all of these things. There's a lot of things to keep in mind, and there's always the risk of over generalizing. But in the current, with the evidence there is, it's hard. You got to work with what you've got. So
yeah, and when we work in the ancient world, sometimes what we got is just really not a lot at all, as I'm sure many viewers of this channel will remember. So we have an audience question for you. How do you see your dissertation fitting into wider scholarship on Egypt?
Yeah, so there's, been a fair amount, I feel like, that's been done with sort of purity in in ritual texts, as far as like temples and priests and so on. But I don't feel like there's as much that's been done on trying to figure out, how do these relate? So this is what is clean for a priest going into a temple, but is it different? Is this a very different thing than, say, what dirt and impurity looks like in everyday life? Or is this more a matter of degree? In other words, maybe you have to be more clean on these same standards going into the temple than you do maybe your house. But what kind of relationship is there between all the texts for purity and for priests in the temple, and then just everybody else in day-to-day life? So hopefully kind of fit in some of that gap.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, filling gaps in research is always a good goal and always a good project to undertake. And so I know the dissertation can produce kind of a kind of tunnel vision, but our viewers want to know, do you have any research plans after you complete your dissertation?
Yeah, so I'm interested in more along these lines, probably broadening it out. So I'm trying to right now get more into obviously the daily life type thing, but I'm also interested in farther exploring the how it relates to temples and rituals in Egyptian religion in general. I'm also interested just in general, especially in the New Kingdom. This is kind of a different topic, but ancient Egyptian imperialism and relationship with other kingdoms, such as the states in Canaan and the Hittites and so on, and sort of that diplomacy and interaction and the Egyptian Empire and that type of thing as well. So I'd like to do more research in those areas as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Sounds extremely cool. Just like all the dissertation work you've been telling us about. So we don't have any more audience questions for you. But before we wrap up, is there anything about your research or your project that you want to tell us that you didn't get a chance to talk about today?
Sure. So another aspect or way I guess I'm maybe looking at the evidence is trying to get at how the senses are used in looking at what is dirt and dirty and how many senses and so on. So when I read a description, like the potter's clothes are stiff with mud. Well, that's probably, it's presumably coming from the perspective of a scribe looking at him. So we have, the sense of sight, but the idea of stiff or firm or whatever, there might be that kind of seems to be the sense of touch, there of something being firm and that kind of thing. And then obviously you have maybe not that example, but other examples, the smells and that kind of thing. So trying to piece together, okay, this is considered dirty or disgusting or so on, but in what ways is it? What senses does it offend that this is dirty or disgusting, kind of a thing.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, David. Thank you for sharing your awesome research. Best of luck with your dissertation and look forward to hearing about it as you look to finish up in about a year, I think you said. So for those of you who will be joining us for future interviews, we will be back in about 10 minutes at 10:30 Eastern time with our next student. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for waiting. Let's just jump right back into it with our next student guest. Please welcome Peter Johnson. Hey, Peter, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. So why don't we get started with you just telling us a little bit about who you are, what you study, and what your research interests are.
Of course, yeah. So again, my name is Peter Johnson. I'm a PhD student at the Institute of Fine Arts, which is part of New York University. And I guess traditionally would classify myself as an Egyptologist. However, I'm really interested in studying, I'll say, the fringes of the ancient Egyptian empire, and specifically looking at that during the first millennium BCE. So I'm really interested in looking at Nubia, Egypt's southern neighbor, and thinking about the influence that Nubia had not only on Egypt, but also the greater ancient Near East. I think often we think about these really monolithic empires such as the Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, etc. And we kind of forget that there are other smaller polities, other smaller civilizations at the fringes of this really large network system. And so I'm interested in kind of thinking about how those power dynamics play out, how these maybe smaller traditionally actors are influencing these really large empires.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. And you're right, studying the fringes of empire, it's also a really big research topic as people are trying to, understand that, these smaller entities, they had power too, and they were able to exert influence as well as receive influence from the people around them. And so what are your plans for the summer based on this research project, and how would HAPS funding help you?
Of course, yeah. So I am starting my dissertation. I'm in kind of a feasibility stage right now for my dissertation project. And so my goal for this summer is to visit a number of collections, both in Europe and in Egypt, to start building out a corpus. So as I mentioned, I'm really interested in this period in the first millennium BC. And Nubia, Egypt's southern neighbor, tends to mostly be studied during a short 100-year period when the Nubians themselves actually established a dynasty that controlled all of Egypt. However, once that dynasty ends, and it's often kind of equated with the Assyrians coming in and taking control of Egypt during this time, Nubia tends to traditionally take a backseat in the history of the greater Mediterranean during this time. And I'm speaking roughly, 700 BC to about 500 BC. However, of course, these people didn't go away. I mean, they have a really strong center in modern day Sudan, in Nubia. However, it's really not thought about how they continue to exert their influence. We have a couple textual sources. Herodotus writes about this. We have an inscription in modern day Iran that speaks about the trade influence that the Nubians are having in this, again, really greater connected Mediterranean, yet we don't really have a lot of material evidence. And so my project this summer is really to think about how are Nubians depicted in these cultures where they still continue to exert influence, and why have we not really seen them on a kind of greater stage during this approximate 200-year period? So my hypothesis is that often Nubians are really subtly inserting themselves in their local context. They're really great adapters at kind of donning the cultures that they're in, kind of donning their cultural practices, wearing clothes so they can fit in, yet still subtly, again, exerting their influence. And so I have a couple initial examples that I have discovered in a couple collections, again, in Europe at the Louvre, at the Neues Museum in Berlin, at the British Museum in London, and then in the Cairo Museum, of course, in Egypt. And so my goal is to accumulate this corpus that really shows how Nubians are continuing to assert their identity in these local contexts over this approximate 200-year period. And for me, what's really exciting is that around 500, when you have the rise of the Achaemenids in Iran, Darius I, Xerxes, probably some pretty common names for folks, you start to see Nubians popping up again. They're included on monumental inscriptions. They're found at the palace of Darius at Susa and Persepolis in Iran. And so how are these individuals, again, who are often thought to be really at the kind of edges of this empire, continuing to show that they are still a force, and how are they constructing their identity? So my goal is to, again, accumulate this corpus and kind of think about the way that identity is transferred. So funding from a HAPS scholarship would allow me to travel to these sites and work in these collections this summer.
Yeah, I mean, sounds like an incredible project. And for those of you listening in who fortunately don't know how a lot of these museums work, traveling there is of course very expensive, but also even if you don't travel, requesting photos and whatnot can also be very expensive. So either way, expensive for students.
Exactly. And I think what is so crucial for my project is that many of the objects, and I can actually, maybe I can share my screen and show you some of the objects I'm working with if that's possible. Many of the objects have never been published or are not digitally available. And this is really true for the objects in Cairo, in Egypt. So let me pull up, if I can. I'm not sure if I have my sharing settings enabled.
If you are able to share, that would be perfect, because the first audience question is actually what kinds of evidence are you looking at? And so if you could show us, that would actually be...
I can certainly talk about some of the objects. So I'm looking at objects of what I call self-presentation. So these are objects where individuals are really thinking about how to construct their own identity in their kind of greater sphere of influence. So I'm thinking specifically about statuary and small scale statuary. These are objects that would have been included upon interment as part of funerary rites. And so these are small depictions of the deceased. I'm also looking at stele. Again, these are the equivalent, again, of gravestones in the ancient world. They often will include fairly formulaic offering inscriptions along with representations of an individual making an offering to a deity. And then finally, I'm looking at tomb reliefs. And so these, again, would have decorated the tomb. And they're really great examples where, again, a deceased person can construct their own identity through not only textual examples, but through, again, representing themselves. And so one of the reasons that this type of evidence has really flown under the radar is that when we think about this kind of late period in Egypt, again, kind of after 700 BC, many of the traditional identifying elements that we kind of use to date objects tend to be very molded together. And so it's very hard for us to tell if a work comes from early in this period or very late in this period. And so a lot of scholars who've looked at these examples tend to just broadly categorize them as just from this 200-year period, but don't really parse, again, who is being identified, which various elements maybe we can attribute to certain ethnic groups. And so a lot of what I plan to do is, again, go in, classify this evidence and say, okay, is this depicting a Nubian based on the name? Is it depicting a Nubian based on certain facial characteristics or facial features? And kind of, again, create a corpus and a kind of language to identify these people who are really integrating themselves in local settings. And I'm sorry, I don't think my sharing is working.
That's all right. You answered the question perfectly, so don't worry about it at all. Sharing your screen to be going above and beyond, so don't worry. It's not an expectation at all. I guess a question based on people who have integrated themselves, it can be hard to identify them. And you talked about developing this sort of like visual language or way for you to help identify them. Could you tell us a little bit about how you're undertaking that task?
Yeah, so I'm really starting from this period of Nubian occupation in Egypt. And again, this is this 100-year period, often known as kind of the period of the Black Pharaohs, because they, again, originated in Nubia. And they really started to exert their own kind of lexicon of style during this time. I mentioned that there are a certain number of features that have been characteristically identified as Nubian. Some of them include, excuse me, the double uraeus. Again, this is the cobra that adorns the cap crowns of the rulers. Also, the way that the face is modeled. There are certain characteristics around modeling the face as fuller, and also kind of using certain crease lines, which has been characteristically labeled as the Kushite fold. And then also other representations such as the inclusion of ram-headed pendants, and rams have a really strong association with the Nubian heartland. And so, again, these have often been associated with these Black pharaohs, these kings of Egypt's 25th dynasty. However, some of these elements start to be integrated into funerary rites in the general public, kind of in private funerary rituals after the 25th dynasty. And so my goal is to go in and see, again, how we can think about the kind of circulation of Nubian identity through these certain representational characteristics. The textual sources, while kind of exciting in allowing us to know that Nubians did inhabit these spaces, tend to be pretty scarce in really telling us about how they integrated themselves. And so this is why I think the visual evidence is so important, because it's a period when the textual evidence is kind of limited in really giving us a full picture of these individuals. And so we, again, have the ability to even construct some genealogies of kind of Nubian families and see, okay, how are they integrating themselves into the society, and how are they choosing to represent themselves?
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we have our first audience question for you. It says, how much syncretism is there between Egyptian and Nubian gods?
That's a great question. We certainly see some syncretism between Egyptian and Nubian gods a little bit later than this period. Specifically, there's a period in Nubian history called the Meroitic period, and this roughly coincides with the Roman Empire, if we're thinking kind of more broad timescale in the Greater Mediterranean. And so this is about from 300 BC to, let's say, 200 AD, and you do start to see a lot of Egyptian gods like Amun, even Mut I see as part of the question as well, start to be integrated with some Nubian deities as well. However, during the time period that I study, there is not a lot of evidence for this actually happening yet in Nubia. It's mostly Egyptian gods that are kind of being circulated. Amun is one god that the Nubians really took a strong liking towards, and I think that's really because he has this ability to kind of be a dual god, and also during this time really kind of be viewed as a creator god over both lands, the Nubian heartland and over the Egyptian heartland as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And our next audience question, I guess, a little bit about you. How did you become interested in Nubia and the Nubian presence in Egypt?
That's a really great question. I first became interested actually as an undergraduate in taking a course on Egyptian warfare, and to kind of bring us about 1,000 years prior to the period that I study, you have a period of Egyptian occupation happening in this Nubian heartland. And the Egyptians start to build these really monumental mud brick fortresses, just on a massive scale. And so I was so interested in understanding why the Egyptians were interested in colonizing this land, why they were building these monumental fortresses that almost imply that there was some sort of military presence happening in this land. And what was so exciting is that for me, Nubia is situated at this kind of crossroads of antiquity that I don't think is often very studied, and particularly it's a crossroads in Africa. If you think about the Nile kind of running as a central highway through Northeast Africa, it's a natural way for goods to travel from the African heartland. I mean, think of things like ivory, certain rare woods, gold certainly as well, but also you have a natural land access to the Red Sea to the east. So you can really imagine kind of this cross where goods, people, ideas are able to move from further south in Africa up through Egypt and into the Greater Mediterranean. So I think often that's lost. Again, we have some scant textual sources of noting that the Nubians were really well recognized for their ability to bring gold into the Greater Mediterranean, to bring ivory. But we don't really think about these people and kind of the lives they lived outside of the fact that they were kind of the heartland for these goods.
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredibly good point. I mean, things like gold and ivory and these rare aromatic woods appear in inscriptions and images all over the ancient world. And so it's important and good to highlight, the important role that a space or a people may play in getting them everywhere, because they're extremely valuable, pretty much blanket across the ancient world.
Yeah. And so also that kind of plays into some of the work I plan to do as well is, think about what stereotypes are being perpetuated. Nubians are often depicted as fighters, oddly enough. They're noted for actually being a central fighting force in Xerxes' army in the kind of Persian Achaemenid period. They're really often noted as archers in Egyptian armies, and then also depicted with certain trade goods. So when we think about, again, the perspective of who is deciding how to represent certain people, what elements are being included, and can we, again, kind of discern Nubian identity and Nubian culture from these representations?
And do you find that these sort of stereotypical representations or representations just from people who aren't Nubian themselves overlap at all with the self-representations, or do you find that they're completely different?
Yeah, what I find is that there tends to be a mixing. I think when you often have foreigners integrating themselves in local contexts, they want to find a way to adapt their own customs into the environments that they inhabit. And so I think that's what's really interesting to me, is to kind of parse, okay, if Nubians are often represented as, let's say, fighters or archers, how much of this archer identity is foreign and how much of it is being imported? And can we look at elements that are kind of native, let's say, to the Nubian heartland, such as, let's say, facial modeling or representations of the body. And then if they're then moving them into these foreign contexts, which elements are they keeping? And so one example that I have really found enticing is dress, clothing. I think this is such an integral aspect to how we kind of construct our own identities, what we wear. And I think you obviously we'll see that in many cultures today. People really, adopt certain clothes because they have a strong association with that heritage and upbringing. And you see the same thing in antiquity. So there is a garment that becomes quite popular around this time in 700 BC, which is often noted as the Kushite cloak. It's a kind of wrapped garment that you see arise. And then one of the elements I'm looking at in these representations of self-presentation, again, these kind of statues, reliefs, and stele is the presence of this Kushite cloak. And interestingly, what does it tend to be paired with? When we have the Kushite cloak, is the individual noting that they are Nubian? Are they using a qualifier to say, I, a Nubian, am so-and-so, and here is my tomb in Egypt? Or are they kind of labeling themselves as an Egyptian, but rather wearing this very Kushite garb? And so I think what's really exciting for me is kind of to gather all of this evidence and then start to see, how are people really constructing their identity through these varied facets?
Yeah, and it like you said, it's great for highlighting this relationship with Egypt, right? Like, am I saying I'm a Nubian, or am I saying I'm Egyptian, but I want you to associate me with this sort of aspect of being Nubian?
And I think one of the things that I am really excited to explore more is how much are these categories endemic, to these cultures themselves. I think we really love to classify things and put them in boxes. And I think I kind of started this presentation by talking about these kind of large systems of empire we construct, right? Have total disciplines dedicated to them. We have classics and Egyptology and ancient Near Eastern studies. But I really think that it's especially true during this time period that those large kind of classifications probably have less weight to the people themselves. They are moving between these lands. You're having kind of what I consider one of the first periods of internationalism, right? A kind of increased mobility around the ancient world that had never been seen before. And again, the kind of fluorescence of cultures like the Greek culture integrating themselves into the ancient Near East. And I think that we can't really think of things as clearly defined as Egyptian and Nubian. And so this messiness is what is so exciting to me about this period, is that you have the opportunity to really kind of parse out certain elements to say, okay, well, maybe you have someone who is completely saying they are an Egyptian and they're constructing an Egyptian tomb, and they are, doing everything that a good Egyptian should do, but then they have a Nubian name, or they are wearing a Nubian dress. So I think it's that messiness that I'm really excited to dive into, because I really don't think we can use these monumental categories that we had been so familiar with.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and actually feeds perfectly into our last audience question for you, which is, when looking at material culture that shows a Nubian presence in Egypt, can you determine things like what is Nubian style culture used by Egyptians and what is Egyptian style culture used by Nubians?
Yeah, again, that's a great question that does kind of build on the last one. I think that a lot of what I'm interested in doing, and kind of a way to answer this question, is to look at kind of the genealogy or history of certain practices. So a really great example would be the use of an offering table. This is a very common type of object that is found in tombs, and it's usually made of stone, and it really is meant to represent a table where people would have left material offerings that would have been meant to be consumed by the deceased. There's a large history of this being done in Egypt in the Pharaonic period. However, the practice dies out, and we don't see it surface again until it actually arises in Nubia during this period around 750 BCE. And so here you have an Egyptian style object. However, it hasn't been used in Egypt for a couple hundred years, and it starts to surface in a Nubian context. And then after that, once the Nubians start to take over all of Egypt during this 25th dynasty, you start to see the presence of funerary offering tables proliferate. And so it's really fascinating because you see that the Nubians in some ways are kind of out Egyptianing the Egyptians. They're adopting certain cultural practices, making it their own, and then reintegrating it into Egyptian culture. So it's such a kind of fascinating mix where if you were to just look at it very kind of briefly, you'd say, oh yeah, okay, that's an Egyptian offering table. And you just kind of put it in your box of Egyptian goods. But is it really Egyptian, or is it kind of a Nubian taking an Egyptian object and using it in a new and exciting way? And so I think, again, this is a really great example of a lot of this material evidence that tends to have been sidelined. Very kind of brief analysis will just classify it in kind of one of your very recognizable kind of boxes, but really we need to think more about the genealogies of how these practices are coming into being and where they're originating from to kind of give them some cultural weight.
Awesome. Points of cultural contact are just so fascinating and cool in any period of history. Thank you so much for joining us, Peter, and for sharing your research with us and all the people in the audience. We will be taking a quick break, but we will be back at 11 Eastern Time in about 8 minutes with some more cool research for you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're just going to jump right in with our next interview. So, guys, welcome Greg to the show. Hey, Greg, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing good. How are you?
Doing great, thanks. So why don't we get started with you telling us a little bit about who you are, what you study, and what your research interests are.
Okay, my name is Greg Wiesmann. I am currently a PhD student. I'm also at the University of Memphis. I know Paul was on a little bit earlier. And I am in the very, very late stages of my dissertation. And what I am studying, I am studying the pyramids of the Old Kingdom in ancient Egypt. So roughly date-wise, 2600 to 2150-ish, give or take. We can't be exact on the dates, BCE. And what I am doing, people who have studied pyramids, who have looked at pyramids in the past, there's an old adage I grew up with, like you always had the questions, who, what, where, when, why, and how. Well, 5 of those 6 questions have been answered, and people have studied them for quite a long time. But the where is the one that's always seemed to be kind of omitted from the academic discussion. And so that's what I wanted to look at. And what I am looking at, what I've been looking at the past few years that I've been writing my dissertation, why did the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, about 2600 to 2150 BCE, why did they choose the locations they did for their pyramid complexes? And in my studies and in my research, I have found many, many reasons that my dissertation discusses, and presumably there are many more that are unknowable currently, may always be unknowable. We're dealing with monuments that were built between 4,000 and 4,500 years ago. So it's really hard to know, especially when there's not much textual evidence that survives. And we're relegated to archaeological evidence. And fortunately, it always doesn't tell the story of these questions that I'm asking. But I've found quite a few reasons why they decided to build these pyramids where they did. And in many ways, my dissertation is actually a environmental study of the ancient Egyptian landscape.
Awesome. Sounds incredibly fascinating. And so with this, presumably maybe your last summer, what are your plans for the summer and how can HAPS funding help you?
So HAPS funding will definitely help me because I will be defending next month and graduating in August, and the kind of pressures and anxieties of defending a massive project that like this, a dissertation that I've never written anything on this scale before. The funding from HAPS will definitely be able to kind of help relieve any financial burdens I would have instead of having to worry about how am I going to survive through the summer and live through the summer when I have this big kind of life-changing moment coming for me in the next month. I think that's what HAPS would definitely fit in and help me greatly in that regard.
Yes, I can definitely relate to that. I'm defending in August, and
okay.
it's kind of like, oh, I need, and they cut off my money at the end of that month, and so it's always just, how can I make the ends meet until the next thing?
And that's what happened here. My assistantship expired basically at the beginning of this month.
Yeah, it shouldn't be this way, but yet here we are. This is why we're running this scholarship program.
Yes.
So you mentioned that you think you found a few reasons as to why the pharaohs chose the locations they did. What are some of those reasons? What are some of your hypotheses?
So my research is kind of a continuation of, there is a Czech Egyptologist. His name is Miroslav Barta, and I've talked to him a couple times. He wrote an article in 2005 that essentially divided the reasons why they chose their locations between practical and religious. Very vague. I feel like that's like, it's like, well, that's pretty much everything. And he went into some details about it. But what I decided is like, okay, well, let's actually get down into the nitty gritty details of and really look at these things. And kind of some major ones I found is it seems obvious to me as I'm studying this and other Egyptologists who are experts in the field. But the big thing kind of off the bat is all the pyramid complexes are located on the western side of the Nile River, right on the plateau, the kind of the desert edge. And that is a larger religious reason with this idea of the kind of cycle of renewal and rebirth and the kind of the daily cycle of the sun. The sun rises and it sets, and it fits within the larger ancient Egyptian mythology of the sun god Ra. When the day ends, he's kind of fighting all the chaos and all the bad guys essentially during the night, and the sun comes up the next day means essentially Ra won. And it's kind of just ends day after day. And so being on the western side of the Nile, that's where the sun sets. It fits into that alongside the larger kind of underworld myth dealing with ancient Egypt. So that's kind of the first obvious reason to Egyptologists when we look at it. Other ones that aren't necessarily obvious from the get-go is that they were all located to near a body of water that existed in antiquity, or a wadi, which is essentially a kind of a depression in the geology that could have been filled up during the annual flood season. They could have filled it up themselves. Don't know the logistics of how it would have filled up for them. Most likely it would have filled during the flood season, which are actually located near pretty much every single pyramid site that I'm discussing. So for instance, the Great Pyramids of Giza, Great Pyramid of Khufu, one of the, it's the last remaining seven wonder of the ancient world. There is an Egyptologist who I've been fortunate to work with, Mark Lehner. He has spent the last 40 years working at Giza, and he has done a lot of research and drawn kind of replica maps and hypotheses of what the waterways would have looked like, of how during the annual flood, essentially the flooding would come up to the edge of the plateau, and that would allow for kind of easy transport of materials, exotic stone from different parts of Egypt, and kind of other goods to kind of make the whole apparatus of pyramid building. The people, you got to feed them, you got to house them, everything that goes into it. There was essentially this harbor at the edge of where the Giza Plateau is now. So he's done a lot of research on that regards, but there are other sites that haven't been dealt too much. One is the northernmost pyramid complex in Egypt today. It is at the site of Abu Ruwash, and it was built by the pharaoh Djedefre. And to put in perspective, Djedefre is pretty much, it's agreed upon that he was a son of Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid of Giza. And he built his pyramid up north. No one ended up building a pyramid further north than he did. And it actually sets up when you go there, it's if it was finished or not, it's debated, but it doesn't have a superstructure like a pyramid. It's just kind of a bunch of stones when you look at it now. But when you stand on top of where it's sitting on the plateau there, it is actually higher up in elevation than the pyramids of Giza, because you see them. They're not that far. They're, for American units, they're about 10 miles. So probably 6.5 kilometers for people that don't use miles. And so they're really not far from each other, but it's sitting up on a high plateau. And we walk around thinking, it's like, well, okay, you can see the harbor at Giza when you're there. And it's like, okay, the ramp's still there. You can see how the water would have come in. How would this have worked here? Because it's up a higher elevation. There's no kind of obvious kind of presence of where water could have been. But when this is what a lot of my dissertation is, a lot of Google Earth has been pretty much my best friend of seeing kind of the overhead elevations. And if you look to the northwest of it, you can see a kind of depressed area where the ground is kind of on this higher plateau, and it goes down a little bit. And people have done research, and there's this wadi in this area. It's called Wadi Karin. And looking at that and looking at where the pyramid is, you just can easily imagine. It's like, well, okay, this would have been flooded during the annual flooding season because it sits lower, and it would have been ease of access to come up, kind of almost like a little ramp that would have come up to the higher elevated plateau for them to build the pyramid. And that one is specifically interesting because what's located there now is there's like this giant pile of just thousands of rocks, but it's not limestone, which the pyramids were built out of. It's things like basalt, red granite, black granite, and all of these stones weren't at the location of Abu Ruwash. They would have had to have been transported from far away, further south to Egypt. And then seeing this wadi, it's like, okay, they would have used this to transport these exotic stones up to the plateau to build. So a lot with the water is kind of, that's what the crux of my dissertation. A lot of the information in the chapter about each pyramid site goes into kind of the environmental factors around it. The final two are more of a kind of looking at a political, kind of the political history of it. One is within the city or the nome. Ancient Egypt was divided into various nomes of Inbu Hedge, which means white walls, which actually the name Memphis gets its name from. Memphis in ancient Egyptian was Men-Nefer, and then the Greeks just added is to it, so made it Memphis. And what's interesting is when you read things about pyramids and where they're built, consensus is that they're built within the city of Memphis or the nome of Memphis. Well, what were the boundaries of Memphis? And this was pretty late on in my research that I decided to go with this, that I don't use the term Memphis in my dissertation. I explain what it is, but I don't refer to the region that these pyramids are located as Memphis or even Menefer. I refer to it as Inbu Hedge of white walls, because the earliest attestation of Menefer is in the 5th or 6th dynasty. So we're at the very end of the Old Kingdom, the very end of the time period I'm looking at. So if we don't have any evidence that this was called Memphis in the time of Khufu when he's building his pyramid, or even Djoser, who built the first pyramid ever in Egypt, of the Step Pyramid, I don't want to assume that's what they're calling it back then. And the term Inbu Hedge actually appears way before the first pyramid is even built in Egypt. So I use the term Inbu Hedge. There's known boundaries of each of their nomes. And so I went with the term Inbu Hedge, or white walls. And that is another reason that they built the pyramids where they did. They wanted to build them within this nome. It's a pretty big, ends up being a pretty big nome. There is one pyramid that's pretty kind of in the center of Egypt, near the Fayum, which is kind of in the center of Egypt. It's this would have been a pretty big kind of lake area in antiquity. It's an offshoot, a channel that kind of shoots off the Nile and heads west. And that's further down south, but that's the only really pyramid complex from this time period that's built there. The rest of them are within this area of Inbu Hedge. And then finally, the fourth one, another political reason, is almost all of the pyramid complexes of the Old Kingdom are built in areas where there were previous elite tombs. Not necessarily royal tombs, they're not built by all where pharaohs were previously built, but elite tombs. So the biggest example is the site of Saqqara, where the first pyramid ever built was, the Step Pyramid. And over the next 450 years, there are numerous other pyramids being built at Saqqara. But the first pyramid ever built, Djoser, he is actually building his pyramid right next to not his immediate predecessor, but like the predecessors before his immediate predecessor. So essentially like his great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather. They built their tombs to the south of where Djoser's pyramid is today. So there's a case there. There has been recent studies there's this pharaoh Senefru, who is the father of Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid of Giza. Senefru is known for he has 2 pyramids at the side of Dashur. There's one, they literally call it the bent pyramid. It looks as like it's going up and then it just bends really. There's a drastic bend. He has 2 pyramids at this site. They have found evidence of early kind of royal monuments, royal burials. There's more research being into it, but they've found some things there. And even at Giza, while Khufu is the first to build a pyramid at Giza, there is evidence of older tombs existing in that area as well. So pretty much there's only one area that I can think of off the top of my head that doesn't have an older burial, but that's there's a whole discussion on if that should even be considered a separate area or part of the larger Saqqara necropolis. But that's I go more into detail in my dissertation in that. But for the most part, they're all kind of within the confines of. There were earlier burials, earlier elite burials, and in many cases, earlier royal burials at these sites.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it sounds like you're making some really fascinating inroads into this question. And we have some audience questions for you about this work. And so the first one is, were the pyramids connected to a specific deity like Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus? And are they pointing to the sky or realm of the gods?
So that's a good question. And pyramids have been in many ways, it's good for my research because people are interested in it. And in many ways, though, it's bad because you kind of have these a lot of fringe theories about the pyramids. The pyramids themselves, I think consensus among Egyptologists is why are they building them so high? To be kind of closer to the gods or the stars. In many ways, yes, that's what they're being connected to. So Djedefre's pyramid, we actually have the names of many of the pyramids of what they were called in antiquity, in ancient Egyptian. And off the top of my head, I can't think of Djedefre's word for word, but it deals with being like Djedefre's pyramid who shines high and bright in the sky. And when you think of its location, it's the highest in terms of elevation, in terms of all the pyramids. It's not as tall as the pyramids, but it's higher up than any. So he's closer to the sky than any of his predecessors. So that definitely plays a role into it. In terms of what they represent and what they're related to, I think a lot of it has to deal with the stars and the sky in general. However, there are things like, so there's the 3 pyramids at Giza. There's been a pretty prevalent theory that the southeast corners of all 3 pyramids at Giza line up geometrically perfect in like a straight line. And they line up to the site of Heliopolis, which is kind of really far to the east, on the eastern side of the Nile. And the site of Heliopolis does have to deal with Ra and the sun and kind of the larger presence of Egyptian mythology. So in many ways, they do connect to both the gods and kind of the larger like sky and stars with that.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Our next audience question, also a little bit related to the gods. So is Ra's battle with Apep connected to other ancient Near Eastern combat myths, such as Baal versus Yam, Teshub versus Ulukumi, or Marduk versus Tiamat?
So while I do teach world history, I am not well versed in many other ancient Near Eastern combat myths. My knowledge is essentially the Epic of Gilgamesh that I have my students read. So I can answer questions about that. Unfortunately, I don't know too much about any really ancient Near East combat myths to answer that question, unfortunately.
That is totally fair. And on this channel, we are big proponents of just saying, I don't know. That is not my area of expertise when you don't know. So totally fair. In that case, we'll just jump to the next audience question, which is just, have you done any research on the pyramids built in Ethiopia?
That's a good question. So I have not. I think that might be a future me thing to do, of looking at maybe all the pyramids that were built during ancient times. But no, I kind of just stuck with pyramid complexes built, specifically royal pyramid complexes built during the kind of end of the early dynastic period, which we call it, into the Old Kingdom. Like I said, 2600 to about 2150 BCE. The ones built in Sudan, built in Ethiopia, they come at a much later time, and they're clearly inspired by the pyramids built that I'm discussing and researching, but they are drastically different in their appearance and kind of their location. So I am not doing anything with pyramids in Sudan, Ethiopia. I'm not even looking at pyramids that were built by later ancient Egyptians, like 100, 200 years after the fact. I kind of made sure to stop at these. I'm not even doing all the pyramids built by Old Kingdom pharaohs. There's sets of pyramids that I've done research on that I completely took out of my dissertation because it wasn't relevant to my current study.
Always a good idea to limit the scope of a dissertation. Otherwise, it can get out of hand pretty quickly.
I realized that pretty early on when I was ambitious in what I wanted to do. And then I started doing the research and I was thinking, oh no, this is I'm going to stick with these pyramids instead. And I'm gonna, future me can deal with those.
Yeah, you're like, that's a future research question. I already have the base for that. We don't need to do that right now. So that was our last audience question. So thank you so much for joining us, Greg, for sharing.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. And for everyone who has been watching at home, we are going to take a little bit of an extended break, but we'll be back here at noon with more Egyptology interviews.
Thanks.
Welcome back, everyone. We're excited to continue with our interviews for HAPS scholarship with some Egyptology students. So we'll jump right back in and welcome Filippo to the show. I believe you're on mute. So for context, Filippo is joining us from a coffee shop. But I think you're on mute, so we can't hear you.
Right, that's it. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I'm passing the call from a coffee shop. So you will tell me if there's too much noise, and then I'll try to move in a better place. But I hope it will be fine.
So far, it seems to be working great. So we'll jump right in. And why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you study, and what your research interests are?
So I'm a PhD student in Egyptology at the University of Strasbourg in France. Actually, my path is a little bit longer because, as you can hear from my accent, I'm not French, I'm Italian, but I've been studying in several countries. So I did a part of my studies in the Netherlands. That was my master in 2018. And then I moved to France. So I had a very mixed path, and also I'm trying to combine all the different traditions from different European universities into something new, which is very European, I think, very multicultural. So I'll be trying to deal with it. And it's about multiculturality I'm talking about in my thesis, because I'm dealing with a specific period of the last phase of dynastic Egypt. That is the first millennium of Christ, when Egypt was struggling to affirm its position in the rest of the Mediterranean world, especially in the Near East, but also was experiencing some major situation in its country about the introduction of other languages, but also other nationalities in the capital of Egypt. So it's about the capital of Egypt I'm talking about, the city of Memphis in the first millennium. And I'm looking at the necropolis of Memphis in particular, looking at the presence of foreigners in the cemetery related to the capital of Egypt. In particular, I'm trying to relocate all the tombs which have been excavated in past years, which are dated to this period. But it's not very easy because the excavations have been conducted in about 200 years from several teams from different countries with different technique of documentation. So what I'm doing is basically a giant puzzle of what has been documented in the past, and then trying to relocate everything in a GIS map which deals only with the first millennium before Christ. It is difficult, but I'm at my fourth year of PhD, which means that I'm basically almost done, and the puzzle has been now updated to an interesting point. Can you hear? Can you hear me? There's too much noise, because otherwise I'm trying to move.
We can hear you just fine.
Okay, super. So what is a GIS basically? It's a geographical information system, and I'm basing my cartography on aerial photographs on which I am redrawing all the plans which have been produced by these different archaeological mission in the past 200 years. So I'm basically recollecting all the evidence and I'm putting it into a new geographical system, updated with new coordinates, and from this I will extract some important geographical information which will help me conducting or answering the questions I'm asking to the material basically. GIS is a very important tool for archaeologists. It basically answers the questions all the archaeologists ask to the material normally, but in a different way, which is a geographical way. So basically re-putting everything into a broader a geo-referenced net, which will help me understanding the physical, but also linear relations of buildings belonging to this specific phase of ancient Egyptian history. Why is it important to talk about only one specific phase? Because otherwise the image we will have about the necropolis will be a false image, will be an Egyptological and not an Egyptian image of the necropolis. The desert where the necropolis is located is a very difficult place. Even Strabo in the 1st century AD was telling us that the necropolis was subject of serious sandstorms which were covering buildings. So what we have to imagine is that the necropolis at the time was an enormous wasteland, as we would say in German, covered of sand, and some buildings were invisible. While at the same time, people in the 1st millennium before Christ were also looking at the ruins of the past and sometimes digging them out of the sand of the desert which covered them. So they were interacting with the landscape in a way of re-extracting from the sand the buildings which were at a certain point covered by sand. This was a kind of archaeology, actually. We have to remember that people of the 1st millennium were as far as the pyramid as we are from Cleopatra, for example. The pyramid were constructed 2,600 years before the Ptolemies. So basically, we have to imagine that actually their perception of the past was very similar to our perception of the past, probably, because they were as far as we are from them. And this is important because interacting with desert, re-excavating ancient buildings, using them again, giving them a new life, was a way of understanding their past and sometimes trying to reinsert them in their own past. In this story, in this scenario, even the foreigners had their role, because the foreigners had their place in the necropolis, and definitely they had an important place because some of them were also living in the capital. The question then becomes, was the place they chose a deliberate choice, or were they subject to some impositions from people that were dealing with the distribution of space in the necropolis? I'm trying to look at the necropolis as if the necropolis was a city. Of course, it is not true, because the necropolis was not dedicated to living people, was dedicated to dead people. But at the same time, at this time, a lot of people were living in the necropolis, which makes the situation more complex.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely sounds like a really interesting, fascinating research question that you've undertaken here. And so, when it comes to this summer, what project or aspect of a project are you hoping to do this summer, and how can the HAPS Fund help you with that?
Well, it's funny to say that I actually come from a very beautiful spot in southern Italy. There's beautiful seaside. There's a lot of people going there during summer, a lot of music festivals, and I would really, really love to go there this summer. But unfortunately, I'm at the last phase of my thesis dissertation writing, so I will not be going on the beach. But I will be probably staying in Strasbourg at my university, trying to finish my thesis, unless I get the scholarship from HAPS, which will be, of course, a great thing for me because it would allow me to go back to Egypt. There is a specific tomb in my corpus that I'm looking at. It's the tomb of an important priest. He was the priest of Sekhmet, the lion goddess, and he built a magnificent tomb in limestone, very close to an important processional road in the necropolis of Memphis. His was discovered in 1850 by Mariette, the legendary French archaeologist who discovered the Serapeum, the tomb of the Apis boats. But unfortunately for us, his tomb was not preserved, and the tomb disappeared once again under the sand until 60 years later, an English Egyptologist, James Kibel, rediscovered the tomb and took some photos. Now the tomb is lost again, and even though some of the objects and part of the reliefs of the tombs are in the Louvre Museum in Paris, the exact location of the tomb has never been relocated. So we don't know where this tomb is. We have a vague idea. My plan would be, coming back to Egypt, to use the pictures, the photographs, which were taken by the English Egyptologists in 1920s, and try to relocate the tomb of Wennefer, this was the name of the guy, through a comparison of the landscape portrayed in the photos and the monuments which are in the pictures with the monuments as they are now. This is not a novelty. Egyptologists do this all the time. So it has been roaded, it has been experienced already. It is possible. And I will try to do it as much as it is allowed by the quality of the pictures. In particular, there are some pictures in the archive of the Metropolitan Museum. I've asked to look at them. They answered me positively. I did not yet got access to the pictures, but I'm hoping to have this access in the next months. And once I will get the total, like the complete set of pictures taken in the 20s of this tomb, I will try to set up a mission in the necropolis of Memphis to relocate it and to take some GPS points in order to have an exact location of it. The advantage is that I don't need any permission. Just a normal visitor ticket would suffice for this short enterprise, and it would be very short. I think just one day would be sufficient to it. But at the same time, traveling to Egypt, staying in Egypt, and also the material for GPS location is not really easy to get. And that's why I applied for the scholarship, because it would be a great thing for me. And also, I'm not funded anymore by the French state, so this would get another sprint to my research, which I hope to finish and to publish in the future, in the near future.
Yeah, and this idea of sort of a tomb being discovered or rediscovered and then lost again is super interesting. And so I have just, I think, a really simple question. Does that happen often, or is this an unusual case?
Fortunately, and we're very lucky, because archaeologists now are investing more and more time, energy, and money in restoration and valorization of the antiquities. Now it doesn't happen that often anymore, but even Egyptians are prioritizing the projects which are looking for valorization of the antiquities. But in the past was a common practice. There was even a way of digging, which was basically we dig a trench and then we cover the trench we have dug before with the sand from the new trench we are digging. So basically, entire sites were dug in, I don't want to say a fortnight, but in very short time, and everything was immediately backfilled. So we were losing a lot of information which could have been reinterpreted in due time, in the course of time, with new techniques, with GPS, with photogrammetry, but now it's simply not available anymore. So once this tomb will be located, then we could start thinking, can this tomb be dug again? Can we dig again this tomb and try to see what is left and what can be valorized again? Because the practice is not the same as it was in the past anymore. The practice has changed. Now everything we dig must be then available for other scholars, but also for public, for tourists and Egyptians, locals, and people from the villages around the site to be admired, to be fruited, to be exploited, but in a positive way, scientifically and culturally.
And so are you hoping that it would be possible to re-excavate it and get another fresh look?
Oh, yes. I mean, Mariette dug an entire cemetery in a few years, and he poorly mapped it. I don't want to say poorly because, I mean, he was a guy of his time. He was digging this in 1850s, and these maps are about fine. I mean, we cannot expect that much from him. But at the same time, what he has dug is an entire necropolis from the end of the first millennium, with a lot of monumental and less monumental tombs interacting with the processional way. To re-dig such a site would lead to an incredible amount of information which could explain and shed light on the relation of people at the time, and the interaction of sacred with mortuary, and also the display of social status in a communal space such as the necropolis. And so the urbanistic interaction between roads and alleys of tombs, this answers more to the fundamentals of city urbanism and city planning more than cemetery. So this enters perfectly into my thesis, but also answers some questions which will lead to a further research outside my PhD. And that's interaction of foreigners. We know that the Sphinx on this processional way were full of graffiti in many languages. There was Egyptian, there was Aramaic, there was Greek. So we can only imagine that all these other tombs would have been places where people would live, pass by, and hundreds of years later live their prayer or just their signature or whatever was in their mind. And I hope that we'll find evidence about foreigners interacting with this kind of buildings.
And how, in the ways that you see or think about foreigners interacting with these buildings, is that how is it different or the same than Egyptians reusing their own spaces, which you mentioned earlier?
Well, the practices were different. We know that the foreigners coming into this capital city, into this cosmopolitan city of the ancient world, were bringing with them their cults and their deities. And we know that they were burying them with their cults and with their deities because we have found evidence of foreign statuettes on Egyptian soil. So they were definitely understanding Egyptian culture and sometimes embracing Egyptian beliefs and customs. But at the same time, some of them were keeping their names and is still believing in their deities. So I think there will be evidence for this kind of interactions.
Nice. And there's an interesting thing that you mentioned at the beginning, talking about your research project, how there's a difference between coming up with an Egyptian view of something and an Egyptological view of something.
All right.
So what could you explain a little bit about what that means from a research point of view?
Well, this is the eternal question, which is actually very fresh and very new, of emic and ethic. What is the point of view of the observer and the point of view of the person which is observed? So this is basically a very important question. I mean, we can do Egyptological, but we can do any kind of research from the two points of view. When we write about Egyptomania and modern perception of ancient Egypt, this is scientific research on the ethic point of view. When we look at things in the way Egyptians used to conceptualize them, this is emic. In the past, in my research, I've been looking at some interesting objects from museum collections, trying to understand them from the emic point of view. It is not easy. It is not easy. We have to rely upon a wealth of data and a wealth of objects and texts in order to understand if actually we are looking from the right point of view. This is a challenge, and it's a challenge that must be taken, because otherwise we will be faking. I don't say faking, but we will be not dealing right with the right questions and with the proper answers.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, thank you for that. And that's also a really important distinction to be making for your own research. And also it can be a really difficult question as you embark on a research project. So we don't have any more audience questions for you.
Oh, too bad.
So,
I was enjoying it. And also, I think the people in the bar were enjoying it as well.
I mean, if they have a question, because I'm about to ask you if you have anything that you wanted to talk about that you didn't get a chance to, you're welcome to share it now. But if not, I'll let you go.
Fieldwork is an important part of my research. Fieldwork is an important part. Me being an Egyptologist, me being an archaeologist, I love Egypt, and I try to spend in Egypt as much time as possible. And I'm ready to spend part of my summer in the worst time for visiting Egypt, which is July, August, when there are 50 degrees outside. But then I'm ready to do it. I'm ready to be back there. I try to do as much as I can. The fact of being in a French institution opened me the way to the French Institute, which is a beautiful place in Cairo, and also a place that accommodates students and researchers with a great library. And this would be the venue, the place where the logistic place where I would start my campaign. Let's call it this way. But otherwise, in general, fieldwork is very important for me, and any contribution, that is not very easy, especially if you're self-funded. Any contribution would be great, really great.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Filippo, for making it work in the coffee shop. We heard you perfectly, so no worries there. For those of you watching, we will be back with our next interview at 12:30. So we're going to take a quick break. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for hanging with us. We're going to go right ahead and get started. Welcome our last interview, Kate. So, Kate, why don't you go ahead and... Oh, you can't hear. Okay. So I think we can hear you.
1 second. Aha. Can you try to speak now?
Can you hear me? Are you hearing us?
I can't hear you. Huh. Well, it's good that you can hear me. Maybe I will just speak without hearing people. I don't know what is wrong with this, with my computer day of all days. Oh, well. I can see the chat. All right, that's good. That's perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Minity. I am a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia. And I can't hear anything. And I hope you will not be able to hear all the ambulances that are coming to the hospital in front of which I live. So this is a great start. Yes, excellent. So I've uploaded, I promise, 3 slides to explain what my dissertation is about. But I need to explain what Egyptology are, because not everyone may be familiar with this term. So let's get into it. What are Egyptology? It is a problematic term for a big group of objects that comprise scarabs, figurines, amulets, vessels, and shabtis, which are funerary figurines, but they're different from regular figurines from the fact that they are specifically funerary in their use, and they usually have a magic text on the front and on the back. They're even if they don't have the text, they are very distinguished from other figurines. So the term Egyptology is a catch-all for all of these things. The options that I had in scholarship were to call them Orientalia, but as you may know, Orient is a very problematic term that we tend to not use anymore, and thank goodness, because it's Orient of whom? It's very Eurocentric and very colonialist in nature. I could have said Egyptianizing objects, but that's too long and too verbose. So Egyptology, which is a kind of neuter term from Greek and then Latin, is the best that I could do. There's a whole chapter in my dissertation explaining why I'm using this term as everything else. So I'm studying these objects in archaic Sicilian context. So we're talking about more or less 8th to very early 5th century BC. And this topic came to me almost by chance, because I work in Sicily on a dig in Selinunte, and we were traveling through various museums, and I started seeing Egyptian objects, and I was fascinated. I was like, what are these things doing here? Who brought them here? Who used them? And then I looked up scholarship, and the most recent publication on them had been done in 1973. So, and there was like a catalog, but it was a dissertation. It was unpublished in 2013. And they did not discuss the use of these objects in particular. They discussed the objects, they described them, but they did not discuss how they were used. So my MA dissertation was on a few of these objects. And then for my PhD dissertation, I decided to continue working on them, but take a different approach. So there is a giant study that has just come out by Professor Günther Holbl on these objects. And his work from an art history and Egyptology perspective is fantastic, incomparable. And he has listed all of them and described all of them and studied all of them from an art history perspective. I'm not an art historian, I'm an archaeologist, so I'm taking the other way around. I am studying these objects as tools of glocalization. So we start dropping keywords here. So glocalization is defined as local reactions to globalization. Now, globalization, to keep it very short, is I'm reading a definition here, a growing interdependence of economies, cultures, and populations through trade and flows of people and goods. And this is something that we can 100% apply to the archaic Mediterranean, because it was a very well-connected, let's say, basin. It was connected beyond the shores of the Mediterranean, but pass me the term. And we can see, and we can see that most regions are being affected by very similar trends. We have urbanization, so people start congregating in cities, and then communities are become larger and more complex, and so hierarchies and ranks start developing. And of course, these people start to use, especially in the 7th century, a kit, so to say. Okay, all right. Read the, okay. Okay, wait, do I have to wait for questions in the chat or can I go on? Okay, good, excellent, thank you. See the problems with not hearing things. So in the 7th century, what happens is that people around the Mediterranean, elite people around the Mediterranean start using, let's say, a kit of the elite person. That includes very fine Greek pottery, very expensive eggshells like ostrich eggshells, ivory objects, and of course, the famous Egyptiaca. And this is fascinating because it means that these objects have sort of prestige. Having these objects and showing them off gives one prestige. But this part of the Egyptiaca has not been investigated for Sicily. And if it has been investigated for single sites. And I'm really grateful to those scholars who did that, but not for the whole region. And I think that looking at Sicily as a macro region, so going from each city to regions to then the whole region, because in Sicily we're dealing with Greeks, indigenous people of at least 2, if not 3 different ethne, and Phoenicians, it's very interesting because everyone is being invested, let's say, affected by global trends, but everyone is adapting their own responses. And the way in which everyone is using Egyptiaca is very peculiar to the place where they are. So in the 8th century, for instance, we see that there are rich indigenous people, very rich indigenous people who are importing these objects from Greek traders, and they're importing 100%, legit Egyptian scarabs on gold and silver rings to show off. In the 7th century, the indigenous people keep doing that, and the Greeks start on their own end with their own objects as well. And the elites of the city are in communication with one another to display these shared customs and beliefs and behaviors to recognize each other as peers. And they're also showing to their own citizenship that they have relationships, with the cool people on the other side of the sea. So they're all part of this international elite community. In Greek, they would say an orientalizing koine. I think orientalizing is a bad term for the well-known reasons that Orient is bad, but this is what it's called in the scholarship, right? It's the orientalizing period. And then in the 6th century, something even more interesting happens in Sicily, which is these objects disappear from indigenous contexts, apart from a very few, but they become absolutely everywhere in Greek context. And this is due to several facts. First of all, the Greeks are expanding and they're pushing back against indigenous people, and they're expanding more. The indigenous people are pushing back against this invasion, which is military, it's also cultural. So they are choosing which objects they are taking for themselves. And also something happens on the other side of the Mediterranean, in Rhodes and Naucratis, which is in the Delta in Egypt, what we could call a mass factory for the production of scarabs and amulets and other things opens, and it absolutely floods the market. So you have these objects among the belongings of people that are not high class. They can still afford a burial, so not poor people, right? It's like, let's say middle to high class. They are trying to emulate elite behavior from the previous century, but the quality of the objects that they can afford is lower because the elite keeps importing the good stuff that is produced in Egypt, and it looks better. And this has always reminded me of what happened with pugs and French bulldogs, which at the very beginning were very well-made dogs, let's put it this way, and they were imported by people who could afford them. And then they became kind of less of a status symbol, but still kind of a status symbol. But the quality of the dogs, and I'm not angry at the dogs at all, it's not their fault, has gone down. And the same happens with the Egyptiaca. And so to go back to my research and leave the dogs aside, but make no mistake, I love them. I think that looking at these objects in the systems in which they were imported can actually help us a lot to understand in how the people of Sicily are actually integrated in pan-Mediterranean networks, because they clearly are reacting to things that are happening beyond their borders, but they are employing very specific, strategies to fit their own local agendas. And I think that this is a nice, counterbalance to the very heavily art historical analysis of these objects. So this is what my research is about.
So one question.
All right. So the question is, what are your goals for the summer, and how can the HAPS Fund help you achieve these goals? Excellent. So I am waiting for my green card. So I have no other source of income other than my scholarship from my university, which runs out this summer, and whatever other scholarship I can get around. And I'm trying to finish my dissertation as soon as I can. So from the baseline, a scholarship would help me pay the bills, pay rent, and access libraries. I am not in Vancouver, I'm in Boston. And to access libraries, unfortunately, I will have to pay some fees, so that would also help. But also, I might be able to go and join my my excavation, my historical excavation in Sicily for a couple of weeks if my green card rolls over early enough. And we have found some of these objects in that very excavation, so I will be able to see them in person, take pictures, or maybe, I don't know, unearth some more. We have pictures of me with several of them. They're still unpublished. I can talk, but they're there. So that would also help. I can show you some. Actually, let me get the slide, because these are all pictures I took in Sicilian museums. So top left in scarabs, the one on the left is not what you think it is. That is not a ring finger. That is a Phoenician, how would you call it, chest ring. It's this big. It's very heavy, and it would be worn probably like sewn onto the clothes or like around the neck. It's very heavy, and it's too small to be worn around the wrist. And the one on the right is a scarab that was supposed to be the bezel of a ring, but it broke. You can say that the scarab is broken. And the ring, if it was silver, the soil in most of Sicily is very acidic, so the silver just disappears like that. And faience does too. This one is made of stone, it's steatite. Above figurines, we have a falcon that is, oh my God, I clicked. Okay, the falcon is made of faience, which is glass paste. And as you can see, it's in a very dire state because it was in this very acidic soil. And the one on the right is a flute player of a type that is very common in Naucratis. I don't know if this one comes from there, but it looks like it does come from there. And these were found in a sanctuary. They were offered in a sanctuary to the local goddess. The other thing about these objects is that they're very often found in sanctuaries offered to female deities, not so much to the male ones. Now, this may be because most temples in Sicily are dedicated to female deities, or like the titular deities of the cities are female. But there seems to be a correspondence between these objects and the female deities. Bottom left is an Eye of Horus on a Phoenician bracelet. That one is actually a bracelet. That one was a nightmare to get out and photograph because it's very fragile, and I was terrified. And the three vessels. So the one on the left is a little hedgehog of a type that was supposed to be made in Naucratis, but 2016 British Museum analysis has found out that maybe it was made in Rhodes. So once again, art history sometimes tells us things, and then science tells another thing. And these little hedgehog ones are perfume vessels, and the hedgehog ones are in Sicily are found in tombs of children mostly. I don't know if the Greeks thought that Egyptian hedgehogs were particularly appropriate for children. In Egypt, hedgehogs can be solar animals and examples of rebirth, but not in Greek culture. So that is a big question mark, or maybe they just like them because they're cute. And the other two are also perfume bottles from Greek tombs. So they're very nicely made. We don't know if anything was inside of them. I don't think they've been analyzed, but it would be interesting to see. But those are little perfume bottles. Like the biggest one is like yay big. And the one on the top right, the Shabdi, is fortunately it was found out of context. We can assume it was in a tomb. They seem to have always been used in tombs, so somehow the original meaning may have passed. But this one doesn't have an inscription, but it is an Ushabdi because the type is of the deceased mummified with the beard, the wig, and the hands like this. So we know that is clearly an Ushabdi. So question, do we see Egyptiaca elsewhere in the ancient world? Or are people using them in similar ways? Thank you very much. That would be my postdoc. I mean, maybe if I can apply once I get the green card. Yes. So the most interesting thing is that these objects are everywhere. In Egypt, they're used with their own, original meaning. we see them in the Near East from way earlier than in Sicily. And the Phoenicians were using these objects since at least the 10th century BC. They were using scarabs. They were making their own varieties of scarabs. And we know that there were factories in Carthage and also in Sardinia. So plenty of these in Phoenician settlements everywhere in the Mediterranean, a lot of them in Spain. And we know that they were used, especially the scarabs, just like in Sicily, they were used for the tombs of women and children because they're protective. We have many in southern Italy. We have a lot in Pitacusae, which is the first Greek colony in Italy. And fun fact, some of the first, the earliest, let's say, scarabs found in Sicily in the indigenous city of Villasmundo have exact replicas found in Pitacusae in southern Italy. So probably same traders, same cargo, because they're really identical, or same origin. So that is why I said they had them from Greek traders. And then we have the sanctuaries. Plenty of these in the Heraion of Samos, in Peracora. We have them in, I will never remember the name of the Temple of Aphrodite. It's the Temple of Aphrodite in Turkey. I'm going to butcher names, Zeytin Tepe. I'm not, I'm sorry, I apologize for that. We have them in Ephesus. We have plenty of them in Ephesus for Artemis. So once again, female deities, some for the Temple of Athena in Lindos, and they are used in the same ways. In sanctuaries, they are offered to deities. Are they offered because they're valuable? Probably. And also we have a lot in international seafaring sanctuaries, and those we can be fairly certain that are offered as ex voto, right? So I complete a seafare, a sea trip, and then like successfully I come back alive, I bring, an offer to the god or goddess. We have some used that way. We have one used that way actually in Sicily, in Mozia, all the way to the west side. There is a seafaring sanctuary to maybe Baal ad-Dir. There's also a small sacellum for Astarte, and there was a scarab. Sure enough, there was a scarab there. So they are used in very consistent ways in the ancient world, but consistent doesn't mean the same way everywhere, right? Because the type of objects with which they are used changes, which is what I'm very interested in. Okay, so question, is there anything unique about what Egyptiaca is in Sicily compared to other areas in Italy? Unique in the use or unique in the types? Let me ask you a question back. Either, okay. Unique in the type, to my knowledge, there are no little hawks or falcons in southern Italy. We found one. I can say this now because it's been published by Professor Holbl in Soilunte, and it was exquisite. It was fantastic. Very small, faience, perfect. But there are like 5 of them, and they're all in Sicily, and none of them are that good. We also know that some of the Egyptiaca from Phoenician cities were not imported in other places in southern Italy, but they were imported in Sardinia because they came from Carthage. So they were not made in the Aegean or in Egypt. They were made in Carthage because the Phoenicians, well, Carthaginians at this point, were making their own. So they had their own subtypes, they had a different taste in what kind of figures they wanted, different taste in materials. The ones made in Carthage are usually made of these beautifully colored stones. Like you got carnelian and you got green jasper and you got all these things. The ones made in the Aegean are usually faience or like other sort of glass paste. Or if they come from Egypt, steatite, which is a white talco stone, or really good quality faience that is very shiny. And the use, that one is interesting because there are many commonalities in which these are used in Greek cities. I have not studied the indigenous cities of southern Italy or Etruria enough to know how they were used. I do know that in the 7th century, some of these were found in elite burials in southern Italy and Etruria and central Italy. So I'm assuming they were used the same way, but I don't know with what other objects they were used. So the answer to the question is yes and no. It depends on the region. It's complex. Um, I don't think I have anything else that I would like to share. I mean, I hope that people like this kind of project. Every time I tell someone, "Oh, I'm studying Egyptian stuff in Sicily," everyone's like, "What do you mean Egyptian stuff in Sicily? Where did it come from?" I was like, "Well, Egypt probably, but also the Aegean." And it's very interesting. Okay, question: does it seem that the Egyptiac objects in Sicily were used for religious purposes as amulets, or objects of devotion, or more as valuable pieces of private collection? Both. So I think that one of the main perks that they had was that they could do both things, like, get you an Egyptiac that can do both. So they were probably amulets, and the Greeks at least thought that they had protective properties, because we find them in the vast majority in the tombs of the most vulnerable members of society, children and women, but also rich children and rich women. So it's both, right? And also the most important thing, oh my God, I forgot, these things were worn. They were not just put there. You didn't just buy it and put it, on a shelf and it's there. You wear it. So they are on rings, and we have clear signs of the rings being worn. We have them around the neck, so they would wear them during life, as an everyday protection. But of course, if it's a fancy piece and it's on a very big, tacky gold ring, then you can show it off. And if you have these beautiful vessels and you donate them to a temple, you make a public show of donating them to a temple, and look at what I got from far away. So it's both. Some are just amulets, and some are very not elite pieces. Like there's this one little tomb in Palermo on a very tiny baby, and he had two things: the foot, or the base, let's say, of a pot with some red ochre to symbolize rebirth, and one single tiny amulet. So this means that meant something to his parents, because those are the only two things that they could afford or that they wanted to put with their baby. Well, so they must have had some higher significance than not just trinkets. So I hope that answered the questions. Also, another question: what are your personal favorite objects that you study in your giant collection? Oh my God. I mean, the falcon that we found in Isolde was pretty emotional, because I was there when it came out. It was in my trench, and one of the other people who were working in the trench was like, "Oh, what is this shiny blue thing?" And my fiancé sense were like, "Tin, tin, 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 tin. What is that?" So I went into the trench without glasses. I was very. It took us a good 5 minutes, but then I was absolutely overjoyed to find that. Like I cried. There are pictures of me tearful holding the thing. It was that one I love. And I also love the little hedgehog, because they're so angry. They really look disappointed. And also in one of the original excavation journals, I think in the 1892 one, Paolo Orsi wrote, and we found a vessel shaped as a guinea pig. Guinea pigs were imported in the 1500s in Europe. Clearly, that is not a guinea pig. I don't know what was going on in his mind, because clearly he knew. But that was my favorite sub fact about those hedgehog things. And they're also really cute. They're very round. Yes, in the next slideshow, if my field supervisor agrees, if the field director agrees, I'll show you the tearful pictures of me holding a faience piece. Ooh, that is a good question. I see. Is the falcon connected to Horus or some other deity? I'll be very careful with that, because the ways in which these objects work in Sicily and in the Greek world is not the way they work in Egypt. So if you find a falcon and automatically think, clearly that's a connection to Horus, but the Greeks did not necessarily know this. So I think that's a very difficult, a very dangerous question in a way. It puts us at risk of making assumptions for which we don't have enough data. So a falcon in and of itself in Egypt, yes, connected to Horus. A falcon in Sicily, I would be very hesitant to make any connections or try to do the Herodotus thing. Oh, well, Horus is Apollo, so clearly this is a temple of Apollo, right? Because we know that it's not a temple of Apollo. So it is difficult. And also they cannot read the hieroglyphs. So when we have stuff with hieroglyphs, it's clear that they don't know how to read them, and they don't know how to use the Ushabtis, because what makes the Ushabti is the magic formula with your own name. But these ones are Ushabtis that have been stolen from Egyptian tombs or other people, and they are in Greek tombs with someone else's name, and that's not how a Ushabti works. So I would be very, very cautious in making those kind of assumptions and trying to find those kind of connections. I hope that answered the question.
All right. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you to Kate, especially for putting up with all the audio issues and not being able to hear us. But thank you for sticking with us. This is our last interview of the day, but we will see you next week with more awesome students.